Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Flanders. I'm a product manager here at Bilstein North America, and today we're going to be installing our newest product line called the B8 TerraSport on a first gen 2013 through 2017 Subaru Crosstrek. Before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the product itself. Our B8 TerraSport line is aimed directly at the growing CUV market. CUVs are making their way to trails throughout the United States and Canada, and it makes sense. Many of the vehicles in this category are all-wheel drive, come with good to moderate ground clearance straight from the factory, and are an affordable option to SUVs and trucks. It's with those attributes in mind that we created the B8 TerraSport line. Each TerraSport application is designed to lift the vehicle 1 to 2 inches, depending on the application. On the Subaru Crosstrek 2013 through 17, we're going to end up lifting the vehicle a total of 1.5 inches. The total shock has been lengthened 1.5 inches and the spring seat lifted 1.5 inches. It's going to be installed using the factory top hat and the factory coil spring, and it'll allow the vehicle to be aligned to manufacturer's specifications. The rear damper is a monotube and has been lengthened a total of 1.2 inches, with the spring seat perch moved 1.6 inches for 1.6 inches of lift in the rear. It also comes with all the supplied components in order to drop the rear differential in order to complete the application. Each set of dampers comes with our patented digressive valving, and together completely lift the vehicle. Now let's take these out to the garage and see Ryan Crane, our senior vehicle applications expert, and he's going to give us some tips and tricks on how to install these.
So we're going to remove the ABS clip from the shock strut assembly, and then we're going to disconnect the brake line from the strut assembly using 12mm. And that'll give you enough slack for removing the bolts. So now we're going to remove or loosen the upper and lower nuts on the strut bolts. So we're going to remove those strut bolts by supporting the spindle assembly. It'll make it a little easier. You can let it hang. There's no tension on the lines. Now we'll remove the 3 12mm nuts supporting the strut mount. You'll want to support the shock so that you take tension off the nuts. You can do this with the opposite hand. So I'm going to compress the spring using the appropriate spring compressor until the strut becomes loose on there. Now I'm going to use the correct tooling that allows me to use an Allen and a 19mm. So we'll start the Allen down the center. We can loosen the nut. This prevents the rod from spinning and destroying the wear bands on the piston. Now we'll set this to the side. Alright, so with twin tube shock absorbers, if they've been transported or shipped on their side, the gas can become distributed throughout the shock. In order to displace that gas back into the outer tube, and for the shock to perform correctly, you'll need to prime it. To prime it, keep the shock vertical at all times. You're going to compress the shock until it goes to full bottom out, and then allow it to come back. And you'll want to do that 2 or 3 times. You might notice that on the first one, there was a gas pocket, and slowly it's displacing it out. Now the shock is primed, so you'll want to keep it vertical at all times. We're going to move the boot and bump stop over to the new shock. Now we'll reinsert it in the assembly. Washer and new lock nut. Tighten down the top nut. We'll torque at a later time, but for now get it snug. You want to ensure that the stem is properly engaged, plenty of thread showing, that the step didn't hang up in the process. Now we'll line up the lower spring in the spring seat. So we'll make sure the spring is engaged properly in the same position as before. Now you can release tension on it. And now you can reinstall in the vehicle. Alright, while keeping the strut assembly vertical, we're going to guide it and mount the top mount in place. So before beginning this step, make sure to go through the same procedure up to this point on the opposite side. That'll give you more movement for locating the assembly. So we're gonna get the spindle lined up into the strut. Once you have the lower bolt, just applying inward pressure will usually line up the top bolt. Also make sure to set the cam bolt centered in its adjustment. The washer goes on the top bolt. Just a nut on the bottom one. Reconnect your brake lines. And your ABS line. Making sure your cam bolt is centered. So at this point, torque all of the remaining hardware to the manufacturer's suggested torque setting. In order to remove this brace and allow the cradle to drop so we can install our cradle spacers, we're going to have to remove this lower underbody cover. It's 312 millimeters. That'll allow it enough flexibility for us to then remove the 312 millimeters holding the brace rod in. Stuff will fall. Now the brace rod can be maneuvered around underneath there in order to create clearance. So here's a complete breakdown of a single rear shock. So you'll get 2 complete parts kits, one with each shock. First you've got your cradle spacers for your rear suspension cradle. This is the spacer for the rear cradle brace and the extended hardware to mount it. Then we have your rear brake line relocation bracket and additional hardware. For the shock absorber, you have your lower spring seat, which will seat down against the circlip. Your boot adapter and bump stop adapter. Then you'll install this shock absorber in the assembly, and washer and nut will go on top. And I'll demonstrate that later. Okay, we are going to install the cradle spacer kit. This is a spacer for your front support assembly and 2 longer extended bolts, followed by spacers that will go above the cradle at the 4 mounting points for the main cradle. I've already loosened the lower cover and the support rod here. And now I'm going to remove 2 14mm bolts. We'll discard the OE bolts and we'll be installing the extended bolts for that application. Next, we need to produce enough space to get our spacer in there. So using a 19, we're going to slowly back it off. Until we can get it in there. Keeping this concave side of the spacer outboard, guide it up and into place. Once you have those two bolts holding the cradle support and the spacer above, now you can remove the first of 4 cradle bolts. Remove that just enough. Hold down on it. Shimmy the spacer up and in between the frame, just like so. And start the bolt up the center. Start the threads. And lightly snug it up. We're going to repeat that same process in the rear here. Backing this off. Putting the spacer up above. And you can leave it loose for now, because you'll have to do the opposite side, following the same steps. Alright, so after swapping the spacers, the cradle spacers on this side, the one with 2 bolts up front for the brace, and then the actual cradle, the 2 bolts back here, I repeated that process on the opposite side, and now that both sides have been installed and tightened down but not torqued, we'll do that at the end. We can install these additional support rods back in place using the Ford 12 millimeters. We'll install the 3 screws that support the underbody cover. So now we're going to remove the brake line from the knuckle using a 12 millimeter. And we're going to install the brake line relocation bracket in that space. So reusing that 12 millimeter, we're going to reinstall it so that the bent tabs face rearward of the vehicle. We're going to tighten that down. Next, you're going to use the supplied 13mm bolt and nut. And there we are. Alright, we're going to have to remove all 3 bolts. First, the one securing the knuckle to the lower control arm. This uses a 17mm ratchet wrench. In order to get that bolt out, you'll need to apply pressure downward and forward so that it clears the lower strut portion there. Alright. We'll continue with another 17mm for the shock itself. And then lastly, 14mm to remove the sway bar link. And lastly, the lower shock mounting bolt. I like to leave the control arm underneath the shock, supporting that. That'll allow me to remove the top nuts on the top mount without the shock falling out. It'll be supported until I can get back around underneath to remove it. Okay, to access the top mounting nuts for the strut assembly, we're going to remove this mat. Next, the second mat here. One push pin there. Where it goes. And usually just a firm pull out where it'll do it. Now you have access to both top nuts. You can loosen those. And because I use the lower control, I install the shock onto a spring compressor. Before compressing the shock, note the relationship between the top hat and the lower shock mount. It's an offset angle, approximately 10 to 15 degrees. So you'll want to note that in relation to the top hat so that you can replicate it when installing the new shock. Next, we'll compress the spring until the spring seat becomes loose. Next, using the correct tools, We'll stop the shock from rotating and loosen the nut. A little bit more. Okay, we're going to remove the boot. Next, with our B6s, we already have a bump stop adapter, but on your factory shocks, it will be fixed and you will have to pull your bump stop off the top of it first. For the new shock, install your spring seat, new adapter, noting that there is a recessed portion of the adapter that goes over it, so installing it in the correct direction is extremely important. Now, your bump stop so that it's flush, and your boot. Now we'll reinstall the assembly. With the spring. We may need to compress it just slightly. And tighten the stem nut. First, we'll ensure that the spring seat lines up with the end of the coil on bottom. Once we have that aligned, but before there's too much pressure, we can now rotate the lower bushing until it is clocked approximately the same position it was when we started. And we can release the spring compressor and begin reinstallation. So now we will reinstall the assembly, lining up the top mount, bring the lower shock mount into position, and then supporting it using the tension on the control arm. That'll hold it in place while we reinstall the top nuts. Now we'll repeat that process on the opposite side to that same step. After tightening the top nuts on the shock, you're going to reinstall your covers on both sides and pocket covers, as well as snapping these push pins back in to support the foam. Then you'll put a cover over the top as well as the Start by reinstalling the bolt through the sway bar link. Next, the shock bolt for the lower mount. Can be reinstalled. Snug these bolts and nuts down, but don't torque at this time. You'll do that once the vehicle's back at ride height. Alright, once both bolts are snug for the sway bar link and the lower shock bushing, we're going to pull down while lining up the control arm. This can take a little bit of finesse, but once you pull down on it, you'll be able to get the bolt to line up. An alternative option is to place a floor jack under here, compress the shock and spring without lifting it off of a jack stand, and then you can, having this compressed makes the installation of that a little easier. That's another method. Alright, so at this point we have a 1.5 inch lift, right about 1.48 and 1.5 in the rear, so 1.48 front. At this point in time, we have our front cam adjusters, the top bolt on your strut. That bolt is currently set to its center position, ready to go to alignment. All of your bushings, any bolt that secures a bushing like your lower shock mounts and your sway bar links, all of those should be snug but not torqued, at which point we'll typically put this vehicle on our drive-on rack where we have easier access. And we'll torque all of the loosened components. Every nut and bolt that you've touched throughout the process needs to be torqued to the manufacturer's suggested torque spec, which you should find in your service manual. And so this will go for an alignment, and that'll be a wrap.